Why is American politics so nasty these days? This week, I asked an expert. Now, this interview originally aired live, but just to make it easier to follow, I've edited in a key clarification early on and moved a more complicated section to the end of the video. Everything else is just as it aired live. Welcome to GeekyJustin Live, the show that takes today's hot topics, throws in a pinch of pop culture, dusts it all with cinnamon sugar, and bakes it until golden brown. Mwah! I'm Justin Lee, and this is a brand new season. So last year we did 24 episodes on issues of faith, sexuality, and gender. But in this season, we're going to talk about polarization. Why are we so divided? Why does it matter? And is there anything that we can do about it? Many of you will remember I wrote a book on this subject called Talking Across the Divide that deals with that on an individual level, but I really want to hear from experts in other fields who've been studying this problem from different perspectives and see what we can learn from them. So my guest today is Dr. Lee Drutman, the author of this book, which I have the ebook of, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. He's a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America, co-host of the podcast Politics in Question, and winner of the 2016 American Political Science Association's Robert A. Dahl Award. Dr. Drutman, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me, Justin. Really excited to have this conversation.
I am too, because I was really excited to read your book because it digs into some of the very particular questions that I've been having about America's political landscape right now and how we solve some of these problems. So yesterday, I asked folks to submit questions in advance that I might ask you, and folks who are watching live can continue to submit questions while we talk. But one of the questions I got was from Cynthia, who asked, in the two-party system, each side thinks the other is just nuts. She says each side is so angry at the other side. Of course, your book, she means my recent book, does address how to talk about those issues. But how did we get here? I think the other side is off the rails. Everyone thinks the other side is off the rails. How did this happen? I wish I could understand. So I think this is really the perfect question because it encapsulates everything I want to talk about with you. And you've written a book about exactly what she's asking. But there's a lot to unpack in this question, so I wonder if we might start here. I think that what she's describing, this everyone thinks the other side is nuts kind of thing, is something called negative partisanship. Can you maybe explain a bit about what negative partisanship is and why you think that we're seeing so much of it under our current political system?
Yeah, so negative partisanship is a term that a lot of political scientists use to describe a phenomenon whereby people are not so much voting for a party, but voting against the other party. So it's sense that, a lot of people might not be super enthusiastic about Joe Biden. He's okay, but what they're really motivated by is getting Donald Trump out of office. Or, people might be somewhat enthusiastic about Donald Trump, but what they're really afraid of is the radical Democrats taking over.
Okay, before we go any further, here's the clarification I promised. In his book, Dr. Drutman argues that this negative partisanship is the result of having a two-party system where all other parties are so small that voting for them is like throwing your vote away. In this kind of system, each party learns that it's easy to motivate voters by demonizing the other party. If you hate them, then you have to vote for us because we're the only alternative, even if you don't like us very much either. It turns into a contest of the lesser of two evils. And even though we all hate negative campaign ads and all the mudslinging, it works. On both sides of the aisle, we end up going to the polls more to vote against the other side than to vote for our own side. But all this demonizing of each other has created a toxic culture of distrust and hate. It removes the incentive for bipartisan compromise and creates gridlock and parties more focused on undoing each other's work and preventing each other from getting power rather than meeting the needs of the people at large. But there's one other piece to this puzzle. Because we've had two major parties for a long time, but this level of hate is new. And Dr. Drutman says that's because until recently, there was hidden diversity within each of those two parties. Northern Republicans might be much more liberal than Southern Republicans, and Southern Democrats might be much more conservative than Northern Democrats. So each party had to juggle competing interests from different kinds of voters and different parts of the country within their own party. This meant that even though we had two official major parties, it was really as if we had a hidden system of four parties balancing each other. But events of recent decades caused liberal Republicans to become Democrats and conservative Democrats to become Republicans, creating a much more polarized two-party system with less overlap, less reason to be moderate, and less reason to reach across the aisle. This, he says, is what has created a two-party doom loop, where toxic and negative partisanship thrives. And there's no going back to the way things used to be. The solution, he argues, is an America with 4 to 6 viable major political parties rather than just two. But for complicated mathematical reasons, this can't happen under America's current voting system, what's often called first past the post. Instead, he argues, we should switch to a more modern voting system like ranked choice voting, which is common in other successful democracies and helps multiple parties to thrive. This is the essence of the argument he makes in the book, and it's important background for the rest of our conversation. Yeah, so, I mean, essentially, part of what I'm understanding you to say just now and in your book is that there's something about when we have just a two-party system, it engenders this kind of thing because you can easily, if there are only two primary parties, it's very easy to get support for your party and bring together. You talk in the book about how the parties have to represent these broad, coalitions of different folks with different interests. Right. It's much easier, rather than giving all of them different reasons to support you, to just demonize the other folks. Because if they don't like the other folks, then
where are they going to go?
Where are they going to go?
Stay home, waste your vote, and vote for a third party. Yeah, exactly. And this is why everybody is perpetually dissatisfied, because the parties themselves are trying to hold together these really broad coalitions. So in Congress, they don't want to bring anything up for a vote. The party, if you watch the political campaigns, there was really nothing about policy, because you start discussing policy and then you start elevating the disagreements within your party, and you want to unify your party to hate the other party. So they won't vote for them, and they'll see that it's such an incredible threat, this election. You got to get out and vote. It's the most important election ever. The other side wins. It'll be the end of America. It'll be the end of democracy. And no wonder we're crazy. And also because of the sorting that's gone on, most people are likely to live and work and have a community of people who are almost uniformly in one party or the other. That the biggest divide in American politics is the density divide. In cities, it's overwhelmingly liberal. In exurban and rural America, it's almost overwhelmingly conservative. And it becomes much easier to demonize the other side when they seem like people who live far away and have very different values. And there is something fundamental about the binary nature of our conflict that, in social psychology experiments, a very classic experiment to divide people into two groups on some arbitrary, condition based on what type of art they allegedly prefer. And, under such conditions, you very quickly can incite people to dislike the other side. It's a very, us versus them, good versus evil, right? There's something in our brains that when primed, has this friend versus foe thing. But what's fascinating about these experiments is they only work when you have two. As soon as you have 3 or 4, and there's no clear majority versus minority, dominant versus subdominant, there's no clear competition for total control, that circuit just doesn't get triggered. And that's the circuit that we're triggering right now in our politics.
In a lot of the viewers may have read my book, Talking Across the Divide. I talk about what I call the team loyalty dilemma that we get so loyal to our teams that there's research that shows that just telling folks that their political party supports or opposes particular legislation is enough to change people's views of that legislation.
There's a lot of social psychology and political psychology experiments showing how people care much more about partisan loyalty than they do about policy.
Yeah. To your point, you talk about how we don't see this same effect when you're talking about 3 or 4. In your book, you say, there's no such thing as the lesser of 3 evils. Nobody says the lesser of 3 evils. It's, people feel like they have to vote for the lesser of 2 evils. And that sort of raises this question that Kenneth asked, which is, why don't we have third parties? Essentially, it kind of says, how did the political lines in America become so extremely divided? And why are the other political parties, like independents, not given the same space as Republicans or Democrats? So as I understand it from your book, you're arguing that a huge part of why we don't have a viable third party, like Ross Perot notwithstanding, is not that we don't have them, but that they don't have the kind of power that the Republicans and the Democrats have, has to do with how we vote, how we elect our representatives. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, so what we have in the U.S. is a somewhat unusual system, frankly, by global standards, of single-member districts with plurality voting rules. Now, in many ways, it's a very simple system. It's easy to grasp. Whoever gets the most votes wins. You elect people based on their constituency or states. And, in 1787, it was, the only system that was used. So the framers just kind of, actually, the framers didn't even discuss election rules at the convention at all. There's nothing in the Constitution about election rules. It was just, that's how you do elections. They're based in a constituency. Whoever gets the most votes wins, and that's just what elections are, right? There was no debate. A lot of other things were debated. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say we have to do elections that way. It's just sort of the way we did elections, and we've kept doing elections, and it's what we got used to. And there's a way in which a single winner plurality election renders third parties as wasted votes, because if only one candidate can win, you want to vote for one of the 2 candidates most likely to win, and a third candidate is a protest vote or a wasted vote. Now, there have been moments in American politics when a large number of voters have said, you know what, it doesn't matter to me which of the 2 parties wins, I want to cast a protest vote. There were that has happened. Ross Perot being the most recent example. In 1992, I think it was 19% of Americans voted for Ross Perot because they felt like, Bush, Clinton, what difference does it make? Neither one is really addressing these issues that I care about, a sense of the political system kind of breaking down a little bit, the budget, deficit, trade, right? So Ross Perot raised issues that neither of the 2 parties were dealing with. But even so, it was still, most people voted for one of the 2 major parties because they didn't want to waste their vote. And also the reality is that in a 2-party system, most of the energy goes into those top 2 parties. Most of the money goes into the top 2 parties. Most of the media coverage, and they becomes kind of self-reinforcing that third parties become the places where weirdos and cranks hang out, and everybody knows that voting for a third party is a wasted protest vote. So
yeah, and there's this idea of the spoiler effect, as you suggested earlier. Right. This idea that if I really, in a world where we have this negative partisanship, where each side cares more about stopping the other side than they do about their support for their own side, where if my support for my candidate is really because I think your candidate is so awful that my candidate's the lesser of the evils, then even if I don't like my candidate, if I vote for a third party candidate as a protest vote and I know they can't win, then I feel like I'm helping the candidate that I like the least.
Exactly. So, it's a wasted vote, yeah.
And there's this, one of the things that's really interesting to me that took me a while to figure out is that, a lot of folks will say, well, but the only way out of that loop, the only way out of that problem where the third party candidates never have enough support is if we all support the third party candidates. But the thing is, I mean, even you talk about like the last time we had a really like viable third party candidate on a national level, like on a presidential level, was Ross Perot. That was a lot of years ago, and Ross Perot did not win by any stretch of the imagination. So there's this sense of it's futile, but people feel like, well, it's futile only because nobody supports them, and yet nobody supports them because it's futile. But actually, it seems that there's another reason that the way that we vote, this first past the post system, this plurality system you're talking about, it helps to ensure that we have two parties just mathematically, because it's always in your best interest to not sort of throw your vote away in that way. And so that when we use this kind of system where it's just you vote for one candidate and whoever is the first one to get the most votes wins, it always sort of comes back to a two-party system, even if you try to support a third-party candidate.
Yeah.
So some of my non-American viewers and listeners already know the answer to this, but I think a lot of my American viewers and listeners may be wondering right now, well, what's the alternative? I mean, what's the alternative to the way that we vote? Because a lot of us have sort of never been taught that there are other voting systems. What other voting system is there? And can you explain kind of in simple language what it is and how it works?
Yeah. So actually, there are tons of other voting systems, all of which fall under the sort of general category of proportional representation, which simply means that the share of the party's vote in the electorate should match the share of the party's vote in the legislature. So if we had a proportional representation system, it would be unlikely you'd have two parties, but say you had the Netherlands has sort of the extreme version of proportional representation, in which the entire country is one electoral district, and people vote for a party, and then based on how well that party does in the overall vote tally, that party gets a percentage of seats in the legislature. So if the Party for Animals, which is a real party in the Netherlands, an animal rights party, gets 6% of the vote, it gets 6% of the seats in the legislature. Now, that's a somewhat extreme version. I mean, I think they have like 13 parties in government in the Netherlands, although it manages to work out okay there. So there are various versions of the system. I think the two systems that probably would be most intuitive and would make the most sense in the U.S. There's the mixed member proportional, which is a system used in Germany and in New Zealand. New Zealanders actually copied the German system after they decided that first past the post didn't work for them in the mid-90s. And in that system, you still elect somebody to represent your congressional district, so you have a single winner constituency vote, but you also get a second vote, which is a party vote, and then the share of the national legislature is based on that party vote. In Germany, there's a 5% threshold. A lot of countries that have some sort of proportional representation system have a threshold, like you have to get 5%, or there's some way, because you don't want to. Generally, it's seen you don't want to have like 100 parties, because then nothing's going to get done. Probably you want like between 4 and 6 parties, I think, is the right thing. The other system, and this is a system that I particularly like, is the Irish system. which is ranked choice voting with multi-member districts. Now, some people might be familiar with ranked choice voting, which has been, I think, getting a little bit of traction in the American conversation because it was adopted in Maine, and now it's on the ballot in Massachusetts and Alaska this year. It's been gaining tremendous popularity because it basically means that you get a second and a third choice vote. So you can vote for the candidate that you like, and then, if that candidate is eliminated in the initial round and nobody has 50% of the vote, your vote transfers to your second choice until some candidate has 51%. So that ensures at least a majority support in a single winner context. Now, in Ireland, they use multi-winner form, which basically is districts of 3 to 5 members, and so parties winds up, if you have like a 5-member district, because of the math and various formulas that they use, it winds up being that if you can get 17% of the vote in a district, you can get a seat in that district. And the Irish love their system. I think Ireland is widely seen as a thriving democracy. It's one of the few democracies, Western democracies, that I think I saw this was the only Western democracy over the last 25 years has had both considerable economic growth and has managed to reduce economic inequality, which I think is a tremendous success. And I actually was engaging on Twitter with somebody who works in the finance ministry there, and I said, well, what's the secret of your success? And he listed a couple of things, but the first thing he listed was, well, we have a proportional representation system that's much more responsive.
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to bring in one of our viewer comments, which is JD. Hi, JD. Says, I love ranked choice, which for a lot of Americans who are not familiar with ranked choice, like when we talk about all the complexities of this, a lot of people's heads explode, and it's hard for folks who have not experienced any of these systems sometimes to wrap their mind around how this would work. And it's sort of like, oh, our system is so simple, let's just stick with our system. But really, just to break this down a little bit, and tell me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but essentially with something like ranked choice voting, rather than just saying, okay, of the possible candidates, I vote for candidate X, I can say, well, actually my first choice is this third party candidate who, I would really like, but I'm worried that if I vote for them, then I'm throwing my vote away because they don't have enough support. But that would be my first choice. And then my second choice would be, candidate X. And then, the one candidate I really don't want is candidate Y. And right. What that then means is the spoiler effect is eliminated. So instead of feeling like by voting for my actual favorite candidate, I'm throwing my vote away, I can still support my favorite candidate, give them that support. But if they don't get enough to win, then my vote still goes for my second favorite rather than the candidate I don't want. And this then is what, as I understand it, empowers the third party and the fourth party and so on to gain enough ground to become viable and to disrupt this two-party system.
That's right. And particularly when you do it in the proportional multi-winner form, that you don't have to get to 51%, instead you have to get to 17%, that really creates space for more parties. And if you have 4 to 6 parties, you can start to represent the pluralism and diversity of this country, that not everybody fits into the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. People have much more interesting and heterodox views than the parties present people with.
One of the things that's frustrating to me about our current two-party system is that when I talk to a lot of my friends are so frustrated with American politics right now. I find that a lot of them, they really don't like the choices that they have, but they find that they vote the way that they vote because they are, like we were talking about earlier, they're voting against the party they hate the most or the candidate they hate the most, Or they have one particular issue. So maybe if my issue is abortion, say, whether I'm pro-life or pro-choice, if abortion is the issue I care about most, and I say, well, I cannot compromise on this issue, then essentially what happens is, if there are only two parties and they take opposite stands on abortion, then once I know what my position on abortion is, it doesn't even really matter how I feel about all of these other issues. It's like my position on all of these other issues suddenly doesn't count for my vote. It doesn't count to the parties. They've got me pegged already as the candidate who's going to vote this way or that way because of abortion. And then that really causes us to lose all the nuance on all the other issues. We just focus on, a few big controversial issues, and everything else goes by the wayside. Whereas if we had, like you said, 4 to 6 parties, there might be multiple parties that have my stand on abortion, and then I could choose the one that I like the best on all the other issues.
Right, exactly. Yeah. We have this artificial bundling of these issue bundles that forces you to kind of adopt all these other positions in order to support one position that you care the most about. And also the parties exploit that tremendously, right? Once they know that you're, a life begins at conception voter, and they've got you on their list, they're going to feed you all this stuff about how Democrats are baby killers and, and make you so angry and think that, all Democrats, basically want to do is allow, women to kill their babies the minute after they're born. I mean, there's just this intense sense of, once we know what single issue you are, we're going to feed you the most aggressive propaganda to make sure you absolutely never consider the other party.
Yeah, and one of the points that you make in the book that I think is really helpful, and this goes back to this sort of there's no lesser of three evils idea, is that the negative campaigning that we see so much of, all the negative ads and all of the vote for me because the other side is evil and horrible, it's not that negative campaigning disappears when you have multiple parties, but it becomes significantly less effective because it can backfire.
That's right.
It's very easy if there are only two parties and I can demonize your party, then the only alternative is for you to vote for mine. But if there are 6 parties, then my demonizing your party doesn't mean I'm going to get people's votes at all.
Exactly. And it may backfire on you because then suddenly you're seen as this jerk who says all these mean things. And you can think about it as like how the Democratic primary worked, which is sort of like a multi-party election in which the candidates had to actually compete a little bit more on policy. And there was this moment when Kamala Harris in one of the early debates went after Joe Biden, and it kind of boosted her for a minute and knocked Biden down, but in the end it kind of backfired, and I think it hurt her in the primaries. Of course, now they're friends and running together. But nobody wanted to go on the too hard on the attack. Instead, the candidates were really trying to focus on what distinguishes them, and in order to do that, they were focusing on their biography and their policy. So it was a more positive style of campaigning, because you can't just say, well, the other party is terrible. You have in a multi-party election, you have to say, well, here's what distinguishes me from the other candidates, right? Think about if you were competing for a job interview, right? You would say, what is the thing that makes me special? Why am I best qualified for this job? Not this other guy's a real jerk,
right?
So don't hire him.
Not just a jerk, but just absolutely the embodiment of evil. And if he ever gets this job, then the whole world will end. Yeah,
exactly. Yes.
So Adrian has a question. Adrian says, I've been third party since before I could vote. I would love to see the two-party system change. I just don't know how, other than to encourage others to vote third party to break the cycle. And this hits on what I was saying earlier, that I had thought for a long time the issue is just not enough people vote third party. That's why we have a two-party system, but it's actually partly the voting system that we have that perpetuates that. What would it take for us to change that voting system?
Well, the most straightforward way to change it would be for Congress to enact a law that changes the voting system to make it more proportional. There's something in the Constitution that mandates single winner plurality voting. Realistically, this starts at a state and local level. So wherever you are, you can see about bringing ranked choice voting to your city or state, or proportional representation. Talk to your local politicians, and I think it part of it is just like, let's socialize this idea a little bit more, that we don't have to do things this way. It's just this sort of old-fashioned convention that we've always done things this way, but just because you've always done things a certain way, if you've always used leeches to cure insomnia, but then you realize that, maybe it doesn't work that way, and maybe there's maybe just trying some meditation or something would help. Who knows but the point is that it's almost has to be a consciousness shift to say, we don't like this two-party system, and by the way, 2/3 of Americans agree that we ought to have more than two parties. But I think you're right that people just said, well, we'll just vote third party as a protest. But the problem is that it's hard to get that critical mass there, and keep voting third party, because it sends a message that the two parties are not cutting it, and forces them to acknowledge that. But you've also got to help spread the gospel that there is an alternative system, and once there's demand and once there's public consciousness, politicians eventually pick up on that.
There's have you seen the CGP Grey YouTube video about ranked choice voting? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, Politics in the Animal Kingdom.
Yes.
That is amazing stuff. People should make sure you'll link to that, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, when I put this on YouTube, I will include a link to that video. For those of you who don't know CGP Grey, he's a popular YouTuber who explains things in really simple language using stick figures and stuff, and does a really great job of it. And he has a series of YouTube videos on voting in the animal kingdom as an analogy to explain how our different voting systems do work and could work, and the pros and cons of them. And there's a really great one on ranked choice voting.
Yeah, there's one on the single winner ranked choice voting, multi-winner ranked choice voting, which is called single transferable vote in Ireland, although that's a confusing title, so I don't use it. And then the mixed member proportional German, New Zealand system. So look through all of them, and you'll get a real sense that there are different ways to vote, and you get very different results based on how you vote. And part of that is just also that under different systems, but politicians will organize themselves in different ways.
Somebody who is watching right now live on the Facebook stream has posted a link on the Facebook stream for those of you who are watching live to see CGP Grey's thing. But I will post, for those of you who are watching after the fact, I'll post it on YouTube. You've hopefully already seen that link. And those of you who are listening on the podcast, I will include it in the show notes or whatnot. So I'm going to ask you a question that goes in a little different direction. And this is a question from Laurie from last night. Laurie wants to know about the impact of our fractured media landscape. She says cable news has been a huge reason for the polarization of this country. Do you think there's a chance of going back to the way news used to be reported, in that the facts were given and viewers formed their own opinion? So what do you think, Dr. Drutman, to what extent do you think partisan and sensationalized news sources have contributed to this problem? Or do you think that they're really just a result of this two-party doom loop where each side demonizes the other?
There was a time, again, I think in terms of history, so I think it's useful to understand the kind of broader history of media in America. And there was a time, post-war, in which, Americans got their news from, probably a handful of sources. There was, in many cities, there was one newspaper which had to appeal to everybody. And there were three major news networks that had a limited news broadcast in which everybody got the same facts. Now, that's not the norm. For most of the time before that, we had partisan press. In fact, there's some newspapers that still bear the names. Some newspapers still have Republican or Democrat in their title. Like the Arizona Republic, Republican, and that's also it's common in many countries to have partisan news. I mean the social media is common in many countries. The U.S. the way that cable news evolved in the U.S. I think does have some interesting interactions because it was evolving as the partisan polarization was really kind of ginning up. So, I think it worked with that. But the media, I mean, largely reflects what is going on, the conflict that is going on. And the conflict that the partisan leaders try to stimulate, creates a group of voters who really dislike the other side, and that becomes a market that Fox News or MSNBC can play to. And the shows that do well are the shows that make people really dislike the other side, and kind of keep regurgitating the same partisan talking points. Now. So that is definitely a problem, but I don't see us going back to that era in which there was only one newspaper for most major, or for most, I guess, small cities, and maybe a few for the major cities, and three major news networks. I mean, we are in an era of media fracture. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have functional politics. I mean, there are plenty of democracies where there is also media fracture, and there's not the same level of binary hyper-partisan hatred. That the U.S. is in many ways, I mean, there are a few other countries where this is bad, but the U.S. is towards the very high end of hyper-partisan hatred, and that's not a function of our media. It's a function of our party system. Now, does the media make it worse? Absolutely, but you could have a very different media ecosystem in a multi-party system that wouldn't base so much of its sort of cachet among certain voters just by hating on one other party, because it just wouldn't make the same sense. I mean, it just doesn't. Like you don't see that in Germany or Sweden, which also have the same social media fracture.
So here to piggybacking on that, Ken wants to know, in response to this conversation we're having right now, about other countries. Ken says, even in countries with more than two parties, look at the UK, it's still controlled by only two parties, Labour and Conservative. The other smaller parties sometimes influence policy. When a coalition is needed to form a majority government, it's still dominated by the Labour and Conservative parties. So what would really change realistically? What would you say to Ken and folks who have that concern?
Well, the UK is not the only other country. In fact, the UK is much more like the US. We got our system from the UK, and the US, the UK, and Canada are really the only major democracies that still use this single winner, first past the post voting system, and that's the reason that the UK has two parties basically, and and Canada, although Canada has some sort of has a slightly different style of politics because of the Quebecois bloc and the nature of federalism in Canada, but we'll push that to the side unless we want to do a deep dive into Canadian politics.
We might lose our listeners if we did that.
Yeah, I mean it's all countries have fascinating politics, but so the UK is basically a two-party system. The Liberal Democrats are kind of a perpetual third party. But once you go into continental Europe, I mean, every country there has some form of proportional representation. Some are more majoritarian than others, like France and Italy. Others are more proportional, like Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Denmark. And in all of those countries, you have multiple parties. So we just have to look beyond the UK, which is more like the US and unusual in that respect.
So it's been a tradition on this show, because we talk about a lot of heavy stuff, and this is for folks who are not political scientists. This is a lot of information, a lot of very heavy stuff, all these different voting systems and things. This is stuff that I've been really interested in for a long time, and obviously this is a particular subject of interest to you. You've written a book about it. You talk about this a lot.
I find it fascinating. I mean, there's so many ways you can run an election.
Yeah.
So many variables. It's like making wine or something. Oak it. What grapes do you use? Anyway.
But yes, I mean, since this is heavy stuff, one of the traditions on the show has been to also occasionally ask some sort of absurd, off-topic questions of my guests. And I asked you before the show, what are you like? What's quirky or interesting that you're interested in that I should ask you about? And you said I should ask you about your green smoothies. So tell me about your green smoothies.
Yeah, man, I love making green smoothies. Spinach, kale. I put in all kinds of weird powders: ashwagandha, turmeric, ginger. Very Chlorella, spirulina, bee pollen. It's frozen banana, frozen peach. It's delicious, and it keeps me healthy, I think. So that's my hobby, is trying out different random smoothie recipes. They almost always. Sometimes I do red smoothies, but I like the green ones better. Swiss chard sometimes. Yeah.
I have to confess, I don't know what about half of the things you just said are.
Right.
So.
Well,
are they?
It's another rabbit hole. I like rabbit holes. Electoral system, smooth. Health and wellness smoothie ingredients.
Are they tasty, or are they just healthy?
No, they're delicious.
Okay.
I mean, I may have a strange palate. But,
well,
yeah, I find them delicious. My wife likes them too, so mostly. So.
All right. Well,
sometimes my kids like them.
That's 2 votes, two and maybe a half, I guess. Votes. Sometimes
if I put ginger in them, they think they're too spicy. But well, lemon is the key. You gotta have citrus or tangerine powder or something.
Let me ask you this, as we're approaching the end of our time. For folks who are somewhat overwhelmed by all of this conversation, talking about the need to have a multi-party system in order to end this, as you put it, the doom loop of the parties constantly hating each other and this always picking the lesser of two evils and all this stuff. To get out of that system, if a multi-party system is the answer, and if the way that we get a multi-party system is by changing how we vote, for the average American, I think that may be a confusing but possibly a positive idea, but they may be also thinking, okay, so what do I do with that? Like, I'm not in charge of deciding how we vote. Are there things you can recommend? Should folks, if they're interested in that, contact their representatives? Are there organizations that are working for that kind of change?
There are a few organizations. One organization is called Fair Vote. Another organization is called Represent Us. Another organization is called Unite America, that are beginning to mobilize and kind of collect folks who share these similar concerns. I think another way in which people can contribute is just to begin to talk to their friends and their neighbors and their communities and say, hey, let's begin to understand this. We're not stuck in this. And how do ideas spread? They spread by people having conversations like the one we're having, or the one that other people have, that we would have if we were just sitting down and meeting for coffee. It's ideas catch on if they seem like they make sense and they seem like they provide a solution to a widespread problem. And my hope with writing this book is to really catalyze that conversation and to give people a way to think about what I think everybody understands as a problem, but I think nobody, or I shouldn't say nobody, I think a lot of folks have not been able to see the whole picture and the systems level analysis, because nobody really wants us to who's in power, and I think there's a lot of pressure from both the partisan media and the party leaders to kind of keep us locked in this same doom loop, because it's really good for their business, but it's not good for our business. So we have to kind of lift the veil and open ourselves up to something different.
Well, I find this subject fascinating because
it is fascinating.
Well, I confess I'm not a political scientist. I'm not somebody who focuses a lot in my life on politics, but I am thoroughly convinced that you're right, that I think that there are a lot of things going on that are keeping us polarized. I think that, things are going on in social media, things are going on in our splintered, news media landscape and so on and so forth. But I do think that you're right, that the way we vote, contributing to this two-party system where both sides win by simply demonizing the other side, is contributing to this thing. I mean, you make a point, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but you make a point in the book about how, used to be we disagreed with folks in the other party, and now we just despise them, we just hate them. Yeah. And that's if there's another, we talked about CGP Grey videos. There's another CGP Grey video recently where he was talking about all the debate around the Supreme Court, and Democrats basically arguing that Republicans are, while working within the rules, are sort of bending the spirit of the rules with regard to Supreme Court appointments, and Republicans concerned that if Democrats get power, that they will likewise, staying within the rules, do things that are counter to the spirit of the rules with packing the court and all this stuff. And one of the lines that I really like from that video of CGP Grey's is shenanigans beget shenanigans. That essentially, if you and I are of different parties and we're the only two parties, and I'm convinced that your party is not just good folks who disagree, but you're just all evil folks, then there's no longer any incentive for me to abide by the spirit of the rules for the sake of democracy and for the sake of everybody having a say. I'm much more interested in, how do I keep you from having power at all costs, even if I have to bend the rules, even if I have to rules lawyer to get as much power as I can. And that destroys us. It destroys us.
Yeah.
So
it destroys, our democracy depends on a shared sense that there is a fair and legitimate process, and by demonizing that process, we lose the ability to come together and have legitimate elections and make policy collectively. And I mean, you don't have to be a political scientist to have a sense that we've lost our way, and that American democracy is continuing to decline, and everyone is going crazy in this hyperpartisan world. And that maybe if we keep doing the same thing, then it's only going to get worse and worse. I mean, that's a pretty intuitive way. That doesn't take a political scientist to understand that. You keep doing the same thing and things keep getting worse. If you keep doing the same thing, things are going to keep getting worse.
Yeah.
You keep eating a dozen donuts for breakfast and feeling sick. It's not like eating 2 dozen donuts is going to make you feel better.
Exactly. Adrian has this as a wrap up. So is a good takeaway message: vote for who we think is right for us this election, then make efforts to change the voting system to break this doom loop that every election is a crisis between two parties. That sounds good to me. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds good to me. I endorse it. Thank you, Adrian.
All right, well, we're out of time, but before we go, I want to remind everybody that this is just the first episode of a new series of interviews on fixing our polarized world. So please stay tuned for future episodes. Let me know if there are areas within this subject matter that you would really like to see discussed. You can be part of our live audience by following me at facebook.com/GeekyJustin, and you can watch this new series and my previous series on faith, sexuality, and gender at youtube.com/GeekyJustin, or listen to all these shows on the go by searching Geeky Justin Live in your favorite podcast software. I want to say thanks to my Patreon patrons, including Jackie, Tim, Billy, Lauren, Natalie, Jeffrey, Amy, Sean, Patricia, Lisa, Joseph, Liz, Tom, Bruce, Carol, Richard, Blamo, John, Surrey, Brandon, Julia, and everyone else who makes this show possible. If you're not a patron yet, you can become one, support the show, and get access to exclusive content by visiting patreon.com/GeekyJustin, of course. And finally, you can find Dr. Lee Drutman's book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, on your favorite bookseller's website, and you can find his other work, including another book, a podcast, and a blog at leedrutman.org. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And also the Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop is available as an audiobook.
Awesome.
Which for podcast listeners will be probably a bonus.
That is always great. I love audiobooks. Is there anything else folks should know before we go, Lee?
I hope people read the book and engage with these ideas, and let's keep this conversation going. The more we talk about it, the more we talk about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been really great having you on. I appreciate your insight on this. Well,
I appreciate you reaching out to me, and I'm delighted that you enjoyed the book.
I did. There's a lot in here. This is very dense, but you get into a lot of stuff with a lot of humor, which I appreciate. So I encourage folks to read it and learn more about what you were talking about earlier with the hidden 4-party system that we had with 2 parties earlier and all this kind of stuff. It's really interesting historical insight. So thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for watching and listening. Have a wonderful week. Be excellent to each other, and don't forget the nuance. Bye, everybody. And finally, here is that clip that I cut from the beginning of the interview just to streamline things and make them easier to follow. This is Dr. Drutman explaining how the parties came to be as polarized as they are today. The place that, I started, and I think a lot of people start, is, mid-century. And, if you go back to 1960, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were running in a very close presidential election, but there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the Democratic and Republican Party at a national level at the time. They both had liberal and conservative factions. They both stood more or less for the same things on most policies. I mean, you go back and read and watch the 1960 debate, they're like arguing the finer points of agricultural policy. It's it's not this like who are we as a nation kind of debate that we continue to have in this country. And as I argue in the book, had Nixon won in 1960, I think maybe the Republican Party would have become the party of
civil rights and not the Democratic Party. And even if you look at the votes for the 64 and 65 Civil Rights Act, actually a higher percentage of Republicans in Congress supported it than Democrats did. And in both cases, it was about 2/3. I mean, those bills overwhelmingly passed. But nonetheless, civil rights kind of became this contested issue because it split up the Democratic coalition of Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. Southern conservatives were conservative on a lot of civil rights issues, and kind of set the party system into this sort of slow sorting and realignment that really happened over about 50 years. And what happened was that for a while, you had a Democratic Party that had liberals and conservatives culturally, a Republican Party that had liberals and conservatives, and it was kind of what I call in the book a four-party system. And I think it worked reasonably well given our political institutions that no one faction had a majority and everybody had to work together. And it didn't matter that much who won a particular election, because there was a fair degree of overlap in the parties, and a fair sense of these are the boundaries of what we want to accomplish. Now, that started to fall apart in the 80s, I think, as the national parties came to more prominence, and as there was the Reagan election of 80 kind of shifted a lot of the Southern conservatives more permanently into the Republican camp, and kind of changed both the nature of the Republican and the Democratic Party as a result. And the parties started to become more sort of nationalized, centralized fundraising and messaging networks, so that it started to be, it used to be that local politics mattered more than national politics, but as the control for Congress became more and more central to people's voting choices, and as the messages became more and more standardized, and those parties took clearer and clearer stances on these national issues, the parties came to stand for more distinct things in people's minds, and it became harder to be a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat. I think that the next really monumental shift was in 1994, when Republicans took back the House for the first time in 40 years on running this very nationalized campaign with Newt Gingrich's contract with America. And starting then, we entered this period in which the control of Congress was really up for grabs every election. And the parties were increasingly representing different cultural values and different geographies. And the stakes just kept getting higher. And as parties, national parties tried to draw sharper distinctions with each other, it became harder and harder for them to also cooperate in Congress, because what they were trying to do was say, this other party is extreme, so we can't cooperate with them, because otherwise that legitimates them. And by the way, if they're in power and we're trying to get back into power, we don't want to help them, because they are they're terrible, and we want to show the country how much they're going to fail. And then when our side gets back into power, we don't want to cooperate with them, because we just want to do the thing that we want to do. We don't want to give them any say over it. And by the way, they don't want to work with us anyway. And you just create this escalating spiral of not working together, of demonization, of extreme partisan rhetoric, and that flows out. And all of us are consuming the rhetoric from political leaders. There's sort of a rise of partisan news that goes along with this. Cable news, I think, plays a particular role on this in the 90s. And here we are in this moment in which there's so much propaganda that the other side is extreme, particularly their candidates, and the left focuses on the most extreme right-wing candidates. It's all about the three QAnon people in Congress as somehow standing in for all of the Republican politics, and on the right, it's AOC is somehow one member of Congress, or maybe the squad, 4 members of Congress stand in for the entire Democratic Party, right? it keeps escalating, and it makes it very hard to govern this country. And it feels like we're on the brink of a civil war.